then will be shared out through Educate Magis with all of you and with those who didn't have the chance to join. So, first of all, let me just say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You're all most welcome here today to today's webinar on taking Jesuit education to the COVID frontier, where our presenters are going to share some of their knowledge and experience with you to help with planning for the next few weeks, months, and maybe even years ahead. So before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. I mentioned that your microphones have all been muted, so this is just to ensure good audio quality for everybody. If you have any issues or questions throughout, please feel free to share them in the chat and we will respond to them as best we can. There will be 2 short polls during the webinar so the presenters can get a sense of where you're at. These will pop up on your screen and be announced by the presenters. At the end, we will have another question and answer session for those of you who would like to stay on for a couple of minutes. Questions in Spanish are also very welcome. Pueden hacer sus preguntas en español también y las traduciremos. So my name is Cura Boyster. I'm Global Citizenship Coordinator for Educate Magis, and our webinar presenters are Jen LaMaster, Assistant Principal at Brebeuf Jesuit in Indianapolis, the United States, and JD Ferries-Rowe, who's Chief Information Officer also at Brebeuf. Jen and JD have worked together for many years and over the past few months have done extensive work on how to best adapt to the new learning environment that we've all been catapulted into. JD has served a number of roles, including English and religion teacher, debate coach, academic assistant principal, coordinator for special projects. He's implemented one of the first school-wide Bring Your Own Technology programs, helped design and renovate student-centered technology classrooms, developed student curriculum for digital citizenship, robotics, effective use of social media. JD has also been National Coordinator for Technology Specialists for the North American Jesuit School Network and consulted for public and private schools. He was an Indiana Computer Educators Technology Advocate of the Year. And Jen, as well as being Assistant Principal, currently facilitates curriculum and instruction, adult mission and identity, professional development, state and federal reporting and accreditation. She's the chair of the Department of Information Services and presents regularly for the North American Jesuit Schools Network and other faith-based and public organizations on technology integration, data for mission decisions, leadership, faculty formation, and library services. And most importantly, they do all of this incredible work with amazing enthusiasm, passion, and dedication, and they have kindly given up their time to share their learnings and expertise with us all. So Jen and JD, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will hand it over to you.
Hi, everybody.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm over the moon, JD. Look at all of these wonderful Jesuit educators joining us today.
I was doing fine not being intimidated until she started reading all of that. I'm like, oh, there's no way I can live up to this hype.
Yes. Well, welcome. And I think this is probably one of the most powerful illustrations I have ever had of our Jesuit network, our Ignatian charism, and how we translate all of that to the students that we serve. We borrowed this idea for this title of taking Jesuit education to the COVID frontier from GC 35. It's a remarkable time that we have found ourselves in. We didn't choose this, but here we are. And I really still feel that we are very, very called, as they were back in some of the earlier times in the history of this order, that we really find the context of our mission in flux, and that we are called to these frontiers to serve as best we can with each other and with God's help. Our first question, though, to you, briefly, as a poll, is sort of taking the measure of the room and how everyone is doing today. So Cura is going to put up a quick little poll. If you wouldn't mind letting us sort of know today, in this moment in time, how are you? Where are you?
I can see the answers coming in here, so I'm just going to give it another couple of seconds
Yes.
to let you all
So can we?
share where you are.
Okay.
Okay, so I think the majority of you have voted. I'll give it another 20 seconds and then we can close that and have a look.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we thought we'd start with this question is to let you know you're not alone. And part of the wonder of Educate Magis and technology and our network is we know we're not alone, but truly, now you have some data. We are not alone in these stages that we're at.
So here we have the results.
All right.
What I like is that we're ranging the gamut. There's a lot of people who are already starting to plan or have a tentative plan. And at this point in the world, I think a lot of us, no matter where we're at, still feel a little bit behind. Because that's what happens when you're into something completely new. It's probably one of the most powerful touch points we have to what Ignatius was going through. He was developing new systems of thought, new systems of prayer, new systems of schooling, and doing it all on the fly. He was in the unknown, and now we are too. So it's okay to be one of the terrified and overwhelmed. We're all going to be there at different points for the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. JD, you're in charge of slides.
I am. So
You can tell we've worked together for a very long time. So when we were all starting to look at some of these items, we realized, and we talked with our teachers, so we jokingly call this witty introduction with banter, that we're all going through sort of these stages of grieving, of change, of letting go of what was and finding the courage for what will be. In our case, in our high school, you can see that's our president, Father Bill Verbright, doing a little dance video to bring the community together in humor, but also having them recognize that they are not alone and we're getting through some of these things. You can see the amazing dance moves of the American Jesuit there. And some of our teachers. In the US particularly, I know we've gone through a lot of different stages from denial to anger. Some of you, I'm sure, are seeing some of the anger that is in the popular press. But hopefully today we're getting to that point where we're accepting this new frontier and we're finding that meaning and that courage to go forward. Obviously you are, because you're here in this webinar.
My daughter, early on in this so we've been, just to give you a little bit of context, we've been stay at home for going on 2 months, and that we've been running school the entire time with a 1 week break kind of early on in the process where our students were on spring break and we were making adjustments. My daughter at one point was doing a video chat with some of her friends and was checking in with her friends and asked if her parents had gotten to the baking their own bread stage of quarantine. So I think that's somewhere between depression and acceptance is bread making.
I have, for the record, made no bread. So very briefly, this is us. This is the picture of the last time we got to go on an airplane together in January. As was mentioned, I'm the assistant principal. I do the newspaper. Shout out to the librarians out there. This is just a little context of who we are. JD's a super nerd.
Yeah, big Legos. Down at the bottom, you'll start to see some quick tips that'll pop up throughout the slides. We'll talk a little bit about those, and there'll occasionally be links. So we have a self-reflection document. Did we bit.ly that, Jen?
No, I asked you about that.
Oh, okay.
I can go back
on it real quick and show you what our self-reflection documents look like.
Can put it in the chat.
You can have an idea, because I screwed up and didn't bit.ly the link. So what we would encourage you to do is, you're taking notes for yourself, is to think about what did you hear that you don't want to forget? How can what you're hearing apply to your current job? What questions you have, that'll be good for the end. And then what one thing can you implement today? And this is kind of a Foursquare reflection that we use a lot in our school. So it gives you a chance to take your own notes and to think about and put into context some of the stuff that we're going to throw at you for the next bit. To give you a little bit about our context at Brebeuf Jesuit, so we're a Jesuit school with a strong sense of mission. We spent a lot of time figuring out how to take our mission, our mission statement, our charism, and translate that into some practical applications that influence how we make decisions, how we teach our students, how our students operate through their day, and how the adults interact with each other as well as the students. We have a very high achieving group of students. 98% of our students go on to post-secondary of some form or another. Our students are incredibly overprogrammed and bring a lot of their own stress and anxiety with themselves, whether it's on the athletic fields, on the stage, in the classrooms, or preparing for college. We are an 800 student school from grades 9 through 12, so that secondary education level. We have a phenomenally flexible schedule where we have 2 periods a day where students are not programmed. They use that to meet with clubs, to meet with teachers. The schedule rotates throughout the day, so that first period for one day might be the last period of the day for the other. And we are a bring your own technology school. Every kid is expected to bring a device that connects to the internet and use it throughout the day. And we pay for the device if students can't afford it on their own, because we never want technology to be the barrier that keeps a kid from getting a Jesuit education. Mm-hmm. When we started talking about this, and especially thinking about the intimidating prospect of presenting to our international Jesuit educators, what we started to realize was that it's not just our context as Brebeuf Jesuit, but our context as a Jesuit community. And we started to think about where we get that context, that foundation from, and how we think about it. And so for us, we draw a lot from the North American Jesuits. We use the graduate at graduation. And so each of those things, like academics, we put that Jesuit spin on it. We want our kids to be having authentic experiences in their academic classrooms and to have the time, space, and opportunity to reflect on that. And so our curriculum shows that.
But our overarching Jesuit identity is also a part of what we're trying to do. We talk quite a bit about, the translation from the spiritual exercises, that you've got this dynamic relationship between truth and teacher and student. And how do we continue to have that dynamic relationship even in other learning environments? This needs to happen on the football field. This happens in the classroom, in campus ministry, in advisement times. And all of that is influencing and influenced by Catholic social teaching. And as you can see, then we have to get down into our local community guidelines and expectations. I can assure you that our government offices love it when I write my variegation reports for them. And some of the folks in the great state of Indiana have learned quite a bit about the charism because they let me, but it's who we are, and ultimately how we are bringing our students to be independent learners of faith in our schools. That never, ever stops.
And so your experience might vary because your local community guidelines, your school population differs from ours, but we get to have this similar context or these similar beliefs and ideas and then apply them as necessary. So we ended up with lots and lots of lists as we started reflecting on our school mission and how that was going to impact us as we went into quarantine. And the image that kept coming into my head was this idea of a crucible. Now, to be fair, my daughter is 12 years old and wants nothing more than to make her own knives and have her own forge. And so we watch a lot of a show in America called Forged in Fire, which is streaming. And so every evening I watch a bunch of people at a forge, and I was fascinated by this idea of a crucible. The idea that we put intense heat, intense pressure onto metal to purify it, to boil it down to its essentials. And so when we started thinking, what is it that we need to make sure, whether our kids are going to be stuck at a dining room table or in their bedrooms, in our classrooms, or in something that looks nothing like we've ever had before in our school, what's going to matter? And so we started talking about this as a leadership team. We started talking about this in department chairs. We started talking about this in individual departments. And what we came up with was this list, this idea that our relationships between the student and the teacher are really what matter for us, that our community needs to stay one, needs to stay together, no matter how far apart we are. That to some extent, we still expect to be the countercultural response to what is going on in the outside world, so that we can be loving and caring even when we're distant, even when in America, at least, we have runs on toilet paper and all of the essentials. And we want to be that response that says there's a way to do this in a loving way.
Obviously, we are very, very focused on the experience, reflection, wonder elements of things. Here in the United States, our system is, there's private schools, which would, the Jesuit schools will fall under, and public schools. And the tension between those two systems is that our schools are really still focused on, like JD said, relationships, community, but this idea of reflection and taking our time and finding and igniting that awe and wonder in our students. And that is something that we do not want to let go of, for sure. And we really strive to work for. And so this really keeps the conversations focused away from just pushing content, throwing out packets, throwing up videos that just speak, sort of like this webinar, at people. But we try really hard to get that back and forth and to create that wonder. And then obviously care of the whole person. This is, it's who are we spiritually, physically, and mentally, and looking at our students and our faculty as whole people, not just caring for that one part of it. As another writer who's looking at things, it really helps a leadership team, it helps a teacher in the classroom anchor the things that matter. What are your critical, and I wouldn't go over more than 5, elements that you want to hold on to regardless of what is happening around that countercultural response? What are your anchor elements? And all of your decisions need to refer back to those.
Half of the people watching this are going, but you have 6 listed there. Yes, we're overachievers.
Oh, well, you are. Okay.
Okay, so when we started out with a lot of hashtags like e-learning or remote learning or distance learning. And we were talking to people about how do we make our school work in a world where none of us are together. And what we have come to realize, especially as we start as we start reading what the scientists are saying and listening to the news that is talking about, we could be doing things like this for 6 months, for a year, until there's a vaccine, until there's good treatment, and we could be going back and forth. We decided that e-learning or remote learning is a term we need to get away from, because it's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is provide continuous learning. No matter what the environment, no matter what the situation, we're trying to give a sense of continuity to our students and to our teachers and to our administrators, so that our entire community, from the parents and the coaches who don't work in our building all the time, down to our most vital students, understand that we are always providing a Jesuit education. Right. It's the new hotness.
He watches a lot of movies too.
I swear I cut like 30% of my cultural references out of this.
So a lot of our conversation recently, so this would be, I would say, in the past 4 weeks, has been scrambling, loss, and adapting. And, you know, even St. Ignatius reminds us we need to recognize our emotions, sit with our feelings, the affective parts of it, and part of that is the sense of scrambling, loss, and adapting. We have, and you have too, I'm sure, figure, you know, how do we hold classes? How do we give student mental and financial and spiritual support? How do we, you know, if you're worried about attendance, in the United States, accountability to the government is huge. And how do you maintain those structures? How do we maintain the arts? All of those pieces are that piece, you know, are part of that embracing of the change. with things. And again, and they're not going to go away, but this slide was just to sort of think, these are all the things I'm sure you're thinking of in your heads.
Which brings us to our first reflection in the chat. So as you reflect on your recent months on the frontiers, or as you reflect on being ready to start a term in a really strange situation, what is your one-word summary of the challenge that comes to your mind or your most immediate concern?
Yes, Brian, thank you for your comment there in the chat. That's what we like about continuous learning. I even really like the term before all of this happened, because we have a tendency as educators to sort of think, well, you're in class, you're on, or you're out of class, you're off. And you have in-class stuff, and then you have homework. And it was this really binary way of thinking about education, where ultimately we want students to always be engaging in that world in which they live in. And so, say in an environmental science class, if I have learned to identify trees, our ultimate goal is not to assign a homework sheet to identify trees, but that as the student is walking in nature and experiencing that moment, they say, oh, look, there's a hickory tree, or there's an ash tree. And that you're really incorporating all of that knowledge in the real world. And it's continuous. And I think right now it's an especially key way of thinking of it, because those of you who are going to have students on campus in dorms, who might have large campuses, multiple campuses in one environment, in person, out of person, how do we build these structures for continuous learning? These are great words.
If we were to do a quick Wordle, community, resiliency, figuring out how to make that connection, and a concern over whether we're making a true connection or building those relationships when we don't have that face-to-face ability. Because we're all, like, I've read entire articles that part of Zoom fatigue is a result of us not actually making eye contact with each other. If I want to pretend I'm making eye contact with you, I have to look at my camera and not actually read your face. And if I'm reading your face, you don't see my eyes. And
Right.
so those are some of the things that are real concerns and legitimate concerns that we have to figure out.
So let's start talking about a few of them.
Important for us is that the Jesuit mission is going to translate into practical guidelines. So for us, when we say the Jesuits tell us we need to understand the context of our students, that means we need to be in communication, two-way communication with our families, with our parents, with our staff, to know what their situation is. And that can be incredibly practical, like my internet speed is really slow and you're expecting me to do video chats, what can I do? To the broader terms of, like, how is everybody eating, and how is everybody getting a hold of food and resources when supply chains are disrupted? We have a responsibility to that, not because we're the school, but because we're Catholic. But that becomes part of that consideration. And so what we did is we started to map through each of those things. Facilitating authentic experiences means rethinking the tools that we have. Providing for real connections and real relationships in this time and age with this equipment might mean different kinds of professional development. And ultimately, cura personalis for us means that our campus ministry, our librarians, our social workers, our teachers are connecting with students in ways that is not just rote academic content delivery.
Mm-hmm.
So as we enter into the post-reflection or post-context phase of this presentation, we want to do some real practical stuff in terms of short-term preparations. For us, this is like looking through 2020, whether it's the start of a term, because we're getting ready for an August start to the new school year, or the middle of the year, depending on which part of the world you're in and what your educational system is. Then we also want to touch on some of the long-term changes that we're starting to see, because we really think that this moment is going to be like a crucible. It's going to purify some of what we do and change things, not just through the COVID crisis, but the way we deliver education as Jesuit schools.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, don't panic. We're all in this together.
Right.
Jen,
So,
this will tell you.
Yep. One of the things that we're going to do, and that goes back to that communication piece, is with our faculty, our students, our parents, our term right now will end next week. So we're about we're about done, but we're about ready to have a stopping point before we restart. And one of the things we're going to ask our community is a reflection of, how are you feeling at the start? How do you feel now? What lessons will you take from this, and what tools will you bring into class? So as an administrator in the building, I am very curious in our community, and in order to build those relationships, on where were you and where are you now? Hopefully it's improved, but I can't say that for sure because I'm sitting in my house. What lessons did we learn? What worked, what didn't work? And so this is a really good opportunity for us to, we've had our experience, we're going to sit and reflect, and we're going to get some feedback and communication on where do we go next? What do we need? And really taking intentional time to reflect in all of the community members.
From a practical matter, one of the things that we're going to focus on with our teachers is to get them to put into context the things that they have done in the last 2 months and start to realize that they can categorize those and take some of those lessons with them into whatever the new phase is going to be. One of the things that I am beginning to have an understanding for is that we have done some phenomenal things. You're looking there at one of the slide pictures. There is the video presentation of a medley of songs of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. That was our musical that was supposed to debut 2 days before or 2 days after we went into shelter in place. Mm-hmm. And so working with some of our top tech students and our production team and our director and the entire cast, they put together a live musical that's getting thousands of hits on YouTube. But that's a substitution. We would never want that to replace live theater. Mm-hmm. And so no matter how cool it is, no matter how amazing the technology was, no matter how it was absolutely necessary in this time of crisis from a cathartic and a performance and a community standpoint, it's a substitution. It's not what we want to be doing. Right. Other things that we've done, though, have actually enhanced our curriculum. We've gotten better at integrating. We had an art teacher who had kids take photos of their artwork from different angles to force them to look at their art from a new perspective. And the teacher's like, I'm totally doing this from now on. It changes the way the students look at their art. This is part of my new curriculum. Mm-hmm. And some things are going to replace. We are working on an online version of digital citizenship right now, where we're moving out of one type of hands-on experience of programming and building to another type. And we think that's going to be a replacement. So next quick tip, a Foursquare reflection with your teachers where they start to divide the skills that they've been doing into those 4 categories. What did I use as a substitute? What enhanced my original curriculum? What am I going to integrate into the new curriculum as we move forward? And then what's a replacement? What can I let go of in my old curriculum and replace with something that's better? Mm-hmm. Another one of the takeaways that we are coming out of this that may have some long-term impact is something that was already mentioned in the chat a couple of different times. And that's the concept of synchronous versus asynchronous learning. And at the risk of boring you all to tears, I want to read something that our principal said in his office hours that he holds on Wednesdays for all of our faculty and staff to be able to ask him questions and think about where he's at in terms of educating students. A teacher had asked how to structure the day as we moved into this online year. And he said, I think it's helpful to think of things now less as homework and more as synchronous versus asynchronous. We want 2 hours of focused work per class per week. That's our goal. So a class is meeting synchronously for an hour on Tuesday. Then if they have 1 hour of asynchronous work to do, then that's what they should do in their class time on Friday. If you want to meet live on Tuesday and Friday, then make it 30 minutes of synchronous followed by 30 minutes of asynchronous. Do by their beginning class on Friday, then Friday is another 30-minute synchronous and 30-minute asynchronous due the following Tuesday. And what we've seen is our teachers have been running with this idea. They've started really to take the idea of what is necessary for live time versus what is necessary for, or what can be done asynchronously away from the class. This is the fulfillment of the flipped class idea, where we really boil down and make the most of our live time. And then we flex our time so that when the kids need to be in small groups, they're in small groups. When they need to be away from the teacher and working and reflecting on their own, they have the time and the space to do that. And what we've seen by this graph here is we have teachers who have embraced the idea of the split class, where some of it is asynchronous and some of it is synchronous. We have teachers who have said, we're going to meet live on Tuesday, and then I'm giving you Friday to work on your project. And then we even have teachers who have said, we're going to meet all as a class for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to let you work in your small groups. Then I'm going to, on Friday, meet with each individual group a little bit at a time so that I can have some more enhanced one-on-one time, one-on small group time with each of you. But they're looking at it in terms of, this is the total amount of time I want the kid to work on the class, and this is the amount of time that needs to be synchronous as a class, synchronous as a small group, synchronous individually, or they can work on their own.
And again, it builds right into that continuous learning. You could do this face-to-face. You can do this in a hybrid situation where maybe you have half the students on campus one day and half on campus the other day. In some ways, I came out of elementary school or lower primary schools before I joined Brebeuf, and it's very similar to a mindset of a primary classroom where you have a time period with students and you're moving them throughout the experience of content, either physically in the room, or maybe, you're a little bit more flexible. It's not moving on a bell. It's not binary thinking that I have them in class or homework. It's really delving into, I have this much time, and how best can I engage actively.
And then just to add one little bit to this, based on something I'm seeing in the chat, this type of mindset actually helps when you are not completely aware of what's going on with your students at home. There's a huge difference between me saying to a student who is working from home, I need you to be synchronous for a half hour this week, and then we're going to find time for you and I to meet up individually, and you're going to have about an hour's worth of work away from the chat, away from the computer, away from the way that we're connecting. That's a lot different for kids who are taking care of younger siblings. And that's a lot different for kids who have household responsibilities. So you can flex their time more and give them more independence if you start getting them to think about, okay, I've got this much synchronous time that I need to account for, and then the rest of the time I can schedule on my own.
Right.
That brings us into our next takeaway, was the importance of office hours and virtual support. Early on in the process, our principal realized that it was advantageous for him to have certain set times during the week where he would just be sitting in a chat room. And this is actually a transcript of the chat room, and I think I looked at it well enough to make sure I didn't have anything really embarrassing there. You guys can zoom in on it and read it later. But what we realized was that if the office hours are semi-public, that you don't have to get around the secretary or go into an office that might have a closed door, that if it's relatively public, people are more willing to come. That those open hours where there's not a set agenda makes people bring their questions, their concerns, their feelings, their fears to you in a more open forum. And that if your office hours are dedicated to listening and then providing feedback to the thing that you heard, then it becomes a very powerful method of communication. And it's not an un-Ignatian way of thinking about it, because that's what our spiritual director does during the spiritual exercises. They aren't lecturing us. They are providing feedback on the reflections that we bring to them.
Right.
The
so
other
it's
thing that we
point of building that relationship and that community that so many of you have mentioned.
The other thing that we've been realizing is that as we move into what the next phase is going to look like, virtual support can't go away just because the school is reopened. Right. We're currently looking at a hybrid model that we'll talk about a little bit later. But if I'm dealing with a school that, because of government regulations, is working at 50% capacity or some percentage of capacity, then I have kids at home. And those kids at home still need to be able to get a hold of the technology department, still need to talk to a librarian about research, still need access to the social services that the school can provide emotionally or physically. They still need access to our campus ministers. They still have spiritual needs. And so to say you only get access to those services on the days you're actually in the building does them a disservice and is not the community we want to be.
Right. So that's one of the pieces too that it will definitely continue. We're also learning that those family obligations, those work obligations, it doesn't go away even in a most perfect world. We have had our eyes opened quite a bit on the responsibilities that our students are carrying and our faculty are carrying. And how do it goes back to that synchronous versus asynchronous. There are times that they need, asynchronously need communication and support from our services.
And your kids have communities built within the school that they are desperately missing right now and
Right.
looking for ways to reconnect. And the GroupMe isn't always going to do it for them, or the Google Meet isn't always going to do it for them. I run the Maker Club, or I help run the Maker Club at our school. And the students from the Makerspace regularly visit our open technology office hours, where we're there to help kids with technical issues, just because they want to talk about 3D printing. They want to talk about programming because they miss the community feel of it. So know that those kids are out there with those needs, and your virtual support in your office hours help them even when they're feeling the isolation of being at home, even if they were just at school the day before.
Right.
Okay, the practical planning section of the thing. Here's where we're at right now. Jen, you want to take this one? Because you've been talking a lot more about these than I have, I think.
So this, again, I'll give props to our principal. He is, when we have a very big decision, or we're in a moment of, and I'll just use crisis for right now, having key principles listed that we always go back to. Whether that can be our mission statement, that at a broader level in this particular area, he's come up with 4 key principles that we're going to help keep ourselves focused. Because right now it is so easy to get distracted by a million things, but how do we stay focused on what absolutely needs to be done? So we have started talking about these 4 areas. In our particular context, we hear a lot from students who tell us that they don't want to miss school because they feel like they're going to miss too much content or a test or this or that. But the reality is we need to be able to give them the comfort that, no, you can get the education, you can get everything you need and stay home and be well. Social distancing measures, we're all dealing with that. That is a moving target in the United States, even by state level. Our particular school sits on the boundary of multiple counties or multiple regional government agencies. And so while students who might be in the northwest quadrant are allowed to leave their houses, right now students in the cities are not. And we're talking about a space of less than a mile, and the school sits in the middle of it. So figuring all of that, how do we train people? How do we be prepared? So I would say our quick tip, we're calling them task forces in the United States. I think that's kind of strong, but that seems to be the going thing. So we have, so these are support consulting groups to help us in these 4 key principal areas. We are not doctors. We are not medically trained staff. Thankfully, JD's wife is, and she's sitting on our medical task force. We've managed to gather either friends of the school, parents of students who are medical doctors, infectious disease specialists who are giving of their time to consult and give us guidance on what is the best from the medical community on these topics. We have created a task force. I don't need to sit in every meeting. So there is a task force that is going to just talk about facilities and these significant program, the physical distancing measures of the school. I don't need to be in those meetings, and I'm rather grateful I'm not, because I only have so much mental capacity. But how, and this is the committee that this is building and grounds. This is our custodial staff, our principal, JD, our CFO, our safety officer. Do we need to do these kinds of things? How do we do one-way staircases? Well, what does that mean for fire exits? All of these pieces, you need experts for that. So we have a task force for that. The academic side of things and how we are talking about curriculum delivery, how much curriculum review, engagement practices. There's a great term I've learned called immediacy behaviors. How do I, in a non-face-to-face environment, make you, through my body language, through my vocal turn, my feedback, all of this, feel comfortable in a space virtual or face-to-face. All of that's being handled by another group.
One of
So divide and conquer, utilize those experts out there, and it is hugely helpful.
One more quick tip that's come from as we've been planning our school and our routine is if you have the ability, take advantage of the outdoors. Everything the medical people are telling us is the chances of infection are a lot lower if the students are still socially distant, but they're outdoors. If you can take advantage of that, do that. So we're starting to talk about what does balancing school safety versus a global pandemic. How can we get classes outside? How can we get clubs to meet outside so that they are not locked away in a closed room for 15 to 20 minutes and increasing their rate of exposure?
Works great until the snow comes, but we'll deal with it.
We don't have answers for everything yet. But we have the group of people that are working on it. Somebody had said earlier, they're like, when you say 2 hours a week, does that mean that you're cutting down on the content? For the end of the spring semester, yes, we did. We consciously told the teachers, you will not get through as much as we get through the spring. But as we start to design a digital citizenship course that will be the introduction to our school for a number of freshmen in our building, we're designing it as a course as if it were the course that we would offer during the normal school year. And so we're no longer talking about what does it look like at 2 hours a week. We're looking at what is 4 hours a day, which is what our summer school system usually runs. But as we look at the next term, when we start bringing students back in and we start reopening, we're asking the questions of how do we protect our teachers who are in high-risk groups? Are we buying mobile plexiglass shielding for the front of the classroom so that those teachers of a certain age or a certain health risk category can have an added layer of protection? How do we maintain continuous student learning for a number of types of students? Students who, because of contact tracing, are told you're not going anywhere for 14 days. Systems where we may be told that we measured the building yesterday, and as we were measuring the building, the two scariest things are walking through the hallways. There's no way to social distance if you have two-way traffic. And then our classrooms can only hold 13 to 15 desks at socially distant measures, and our class sizes are 22 to 24. So if half of our kids are staying at home, how do we maintain continuous learning? Some schools have enough extra classrooms that they're talking about setting up systems where there are 2 classrooms and 1 teacher moving between the 2 of them. Some places are looking at what we're looking at, and that's what this image is here, where we're installing cameras in the classroom so that the classroom feel can be experienced even by a student who's sitting at home. That's more expensive, but it's certainly an option if you've got it. And then always keeping in mind that we need to have the flexibility that we might not be in school full time. At any point, the government might say, or we as a school might say, we need to be at home for 14 days. And so we're going to do that. So we need the flexibility to provide continuous learning in this situation, just like we are right now. Keep in mind that sometimes your teachers might have to stay at home. And if your teachers are at home, 14 days is a long time for a substitute. So we need to provide continuous learning even if the teacher is teaching from home on quarantine. Right. We're also having talks about what do we do with digital versus paper supplies. You're not going to hand back the homework if half your class is at home. Right. How do you capture class notes? How do you do presentations and demos? I started assigning remote cameras to teachers who are doing tabletop demonstrations from home over summer school. So these are all conversations that are great to have about what does learning look like in this environment and in this system. And those are the conversations that we're beginning to have intensely, even though right now for us, August seems like a long way away. It's not if you have to touch 45 classrooms.
Right. Or that you have classes that are lab-based classes that you might have to make take-home kits. So students have beakers, or students, even an art class. Our students didn't have enough clay to finish their pottery class. Well, we've got a pottery class on the books for the fall. So are we going to create kits that students check out with all the materials that they need so that they can have that full experience at
home? I'm a huge fan of tools. I'm a geek. It's what I do. And I think the tools have made a difference for what we've done. We have video conference, we could not have done what we're doing now 15 years ago. It's because of video conferencing, because of learning management systems. Some schools are just now realizing that learning management system that they've ignored for years is a vital part of their continuous education plan. But a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, we have almost every provider of educational technology tools is giving us free systems right now.
Right.
That's going to end. Google is ending their extension of free tools in September. Some of them are ending before that. Some of them said 6 months. Eventually, these ed tech companies are going to want to be paid. And so it's going to start costing money. So it's important for us now to be talking with our teachers, with our students, and with our administrators about which tools are best helping us fulfill our mission. Going back to the crucible, back to our core principles, which ones do we have to have? And in having those, which ones are we going to pay for, and which ones are we going to use the next best thing because of the cost?
Right.
I spent the beginning part of this week looking at executive functioning things, because when you don't have a teacher standing over you, making sure your homework is done, you need to get better at planning your own time. And that's not something that we teach our high school students as a conscious effort, but it's something that might be necessary in a hybrid world. We use an education technology committee, but there's a lot of ways to do it where you get that feedback from students and from teachers about what tools and what skills they need. The one caution that I make to everybody is avoid the one ring. You're not going to find the one tool that solves every single problem that you have, and avoid the Wild West. If every single teacher is running their own system, it will overwhelm the students and it will overwhelm the parents. And in this environment, you will definitely hear about it.
Okay, so I'm watching my time here, but part of the planning to consider is your human resources, and this isn't just teachers, this is everyone in the building. So who do you need in what core areas? So for example, in our world, we have never had a nurse in the building. Haven't needed one, haven't been required by law. We have some medically trained people if there is an emergency, but we don't have a nurse. We're probably going to need to hire a nurse, or we're really going to have to train somebody up. So what do we need now? We're starting to have those conversations, and the nurse is the one that's the most obvious to us. And what do we need in 2 months? If this continues to go on, do we need more counselors? Do we need another social worker? Does campus ministry need more help? Because it's just 2 of them against 800 students, and it's a lot. Recognizing roles and responsibilities. So if you have, so we have a learning support system for students who have learning needs that are specialized. Do we need to have one person who's sort of in charge of the structural part while the others support the students? You know, how are roles possibly changing? I do a lot of professional development, obviously, and I really like this framework. You can actually see this is from a group from Corwin Publishers, and I put the link in the slides, which we will share out. But this idea that we have these surface conversations with teachers, so big picture, webinars, keynotes like we're doing today, then how do we deepen that knowledge and transfer? How do we do workshops together, maybe in a department? How do we start implementing support? So like JD was talking about the summer school classes. So we've had a big webinar with a professor who came and talked to our faculty. Departments started workshopping, what does this mean for us? And now we have curricular teams, so the DigCit team, the team that teaches speech, the religious studies teams are getting together saying, okay, we've got a month now, how do we do this? And what is it going to look in the day-to-day? And then coaching and ongoing support. It's relationship building with your faculty. It's putting a foundation of trust underneath them when everything's been yanked away, and it helps across the board. It also helps with your teachers, because we've learned, we always knew this, but predictability and support, that kind of environment. Can I predict what comes next? And do I feel supported in my environment? Makes for happy students, makes for happy parents, and a productive continuous learning environment. One of the things then JD mentioned, also get ready, we're starting to get questions from our faculty about home office and ergonomic support. Some of you mentioned about the curriculum piece and are we teaching less? So right now, yes, we are teaching less because we're in an emergency online environment when we had no time. We had it from a Thursday to a Monday to get ready for that. So we shortened our time in class. We shortened the bell schedule, we shortened the curriculum, we shortened the mental strain on students and faculty because there was so much going on.
And so some of the discussion that we're having now is, now that we know that that gap exists,
right.
How do we prepare for our students next fall coming in where we've got some gaps and the curriculum's not going to line up the way that it usually does from year to year?
Right. But we also don't want to water it down to the point where they're not getting what they need. So use your framework, use the IPP. We are a big backwards design school. We like to use that process where you set your learning objectives and sort of work backwards to see how you get there. We've talked a lot about pre-tests and post-tests. So in the US, you would take Spanish 1 language and then move to second year Spanish. Well, Spanish 1 may not have all the skills that traditionally they would have going into Spanish 2. So how do we pre-test the students to see where they are when the term begins so that we can better adjust what our first month or so looks like to have them get their needs? What are new potential for feedback? JD and I, we've been playing with an idea that when you write your paper, as opposed to either marking it all up with your red pen or putting comments off to the side, there are ways to do voice notes. Ooh, I really like how you had this sentence here. Oh, watch this claim because you don't support it. All of that verbally, it builds relationship because I, as a student, I actually hear my teacher's voice and to some degree I miss them. And it's also less work, honestly, on the teacher's part because you're just sort of going through and you're giving verbal comments and you're not thinking about the exact wording. What are conferencing? You know, how do we break them up into small groups again? And how do we do writers' workshops? So luckily for us, we had a written curriculum and we had just finished doing several years of backwards design across the board in all our curricula. So we have a great start and we've been thinking about it, but we need to really start reflecting on, in this context, what is a reasonable experience in academics for students that supports their awe and wonder, does not just shove stuff at them, makes them think and gets them into being those independent thinkers.
And we don't have all of the answers yet. We're currently struggling with the idea. We've spent so many years teaching our teachers to be constructive and to be hands-on. And we're like, when we're spacing everything out by 6 feet, it makes group work look really awkward. Hands-on is very difficult to do. And so we're starting to talk about, is the hands-on the asynchronous part that they would do at home? Right. And the synchronous part is about community building and answering questions. So there's going to be a mind shift in terms of how our teachers think about delivering content and instruction. And we're there to support them for that. And I believe
that's it. We have our last little slide to sort of ask you which area, part out of our own curiosity, part to hopefully build some networks, you know, which area that we have spoken about is of interest, because it's a lot. Please don't try to do all this tomorrow. Focus on, again, those key principles, but take a bite and think about what you might like to do. And I think while they're answering that poll, we have a little bit of time at least to check the chat room and see if we had any questions there. Or Kira, what did you think about opening mics to ask questions?
Yeah, so we actually have quite a number of participants. So I think
yes,
possibly going through the chat is the easiest.
Okay.
I can see all of the responses coming in on the poll. So if we want to have a little scroll of the chat.
So if you have any specific questions, we tried to keep an eye on it a little bit. But while we have a few minutes, I'm wrapping up. Curious. This has been a delightful experience for us. I'm just so amazed at all the places that you've come from.
Yeah, so there's lots of thank you messages coming in.
Thank you.
Oh. So here's a question.
Oh yes, that's been a big conversation in the States, and I missed to see who asked the question. So we are tuition-based in the United States versus the free option of the public school down the road. And it is a significant investment to come to many of our schools in the US and Canada, not all, but many of them. So how how do we make it worth their while? Honestly, the biggest conversation. So we have been very fortunate at Brebeuf that only a couple of people asked about tuition changes, and they were satisfied with this answer. The public schools, because they are so large, so our main competing high school for students that our students would go to has 4,000 students. We have 800 students. Again, it's that mission-based education. Why do you send your child to a Jesuit school? Because I want them to be seen and heard as a whole person, because I wanted them to develop spiritually, academically, and emotionally. I want them to have close personal relationships with their teachers and the support teams. I want the family to have a sense of being cared for. And I want teachers who aren't just throwing content at them, but I want teachers who are actively engaging them in order to, awe and wonder. I always like to say awe and wonder. That's what we offer.
And so as we start planning our classrooms, as we start planning our curriculum, as we start planning what it looks like when we reopen, that's what we can't let go of. Because if we were to let go of those community building, relationship building opportunities, that is the hallmark of what a Brebeuf Jesuit education is, then we can't compete with the public school that's free, and we can't compete with the private school who's going to try and maintain some of that. And so our job becomes to distinguish what it is that makes us the good school, and then to explain to our community, including our potential incoming community, why we are able to provide that no matter what the global circumstances are. Right. And so we're spending a lot of time on that kind of classroom design and that kind of moment. It's going to be a lot
of pictures of our teacher
and our student at one desk.
Right. Well, and we're thinking about these things. It's predictable. And so if I am a parent trying to figure out where my child is going to succeed as a whole person, I'm going to look at a school that's planning, that cares about their health and safety and their academics. And hey, spirituality.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned that, Jen, there were a couple of questions, and one question that came in Spanish, which was kind of how do you support spiritual formation and cura personalis, both for faculty and for students?
So right now, we are fortunate enough that we can live stream a daily mass from the Jesuits in the building, and they do that on Facebook Live. And that has been a remarkable community building. We've rather been shocked just to sort of see each other there and to still have mass. It's streamed from the chapel, so there is that sense of togetherness. Our campus ministry program, one was actually here in the call, has developed a multi-week retreat for faculty to go through, and small faith sharing groups that meet again, synchronously and asynchronously. We still met, so I lead the formation program for first and second year faculty. We still met in a setting like this in Zoom to talk about the readings that we had done and the questions that we had and how it applies to our lives. So all of those groups are still meeting. We still broadcast a daily examen that's done by a student every day.
Over Instagram, and gets lots of buzz on it. So
it gets a lot, and it's just, again, it's keeping those sort of routines. So we always start the day with daily mass. So we always start the day with daily mass. I just happen to log in on Facebook rather than walking down to halt to the chapel. I get to end my day with an examen by a student. It's not on the PA system, but it's on Instagram. It's great. I have that. It still feels supported. I still have the opportunity to go on retreat. We're going to have an Ignatian lunch next week to talk about the apostolic preferences. We were up to the environment, care for our environment. And so the Jesuit who runs that, we're going to meet at lunchtime and we're going to get on the Zoom. And he has asked a couple of teachers from environmental science to talk about how that charism is lived out on our campus and in our classrooms. So we're still here, like those elements.
George and Therese asked a question about Educate Magis providing best practice resources. And I can tell you that in addition to Educate Magis, Twitter has been a godsend for me. And then entire communities have sprung up around different tools that you're using. I spent a great deal of last week, the video editing system that our teachers use and that our students are trained on is WeVideo, which is a free/freemium product that gives you online video editing capability. And there's an entire community of educators talking about the best ways to deliver content instruction through video, as well as to require students to make videos to show how to give them choice in demonstrating mastery. And so find those communities online that can help support you in your educational goals. And find the community that you can just like throw a question out on Twitter and know that you're going to get some responses. Saturday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern in the United States, Catholic Ed Chat is a Twitter chat that has just groups of dedicated educators who are trying to figure out how we do this.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I also just wanted to mention, for those of you who may not have seen yet, that Educate Modules will be hosting an online retreat next week from Monday through Thursday. So you can find information on that on the platform as well. And I can see there are loads and loads more questions and comments coming in, but I'm conscious of our time, both of the participants and Jen and JD. So what we might do is wrap it up there, and we will take these questions, and we, the Educate Modules team, together with Jen and JD perhaps, will go through these questions, and if there are any that we can answer via email or via the platform, we will do that. And this has also given us good insight as to what the needs and challenges are for all of you around the world at the moment, and we will do our best to support you in those. Yes. So does that sound okay, Jen, JD?
That sounds great. Thank you for the Twitter follows. We're all in the Educate Modules platform too, if you want to reach out and ask the question. But I love the idea of looking through and seeing if we can't help with a little Q&A or frequently asked questions, or even just start doing the conversations in Educate Modules on those topics and start that conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely, great idea. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, why don't we?
So we have loads of input there and loads of food for thought.
It's great.
So Jen and JD, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you everybody for joining, for taking the time to be here, to share your questions, your insights. And I hope that we can all continue to support each other through this time. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful day and a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.